Hey everyone, this is Matt here. I have another opening for you. This is the Slav Defense. It's a fairly common opening at top level play. It's a Queen's Gambit decline line, and it starts out with the Queen's Gambit, which is pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and black plays pawn to c6. The Slav Defense is emphasizing getting the light squared bishop out of the pawn chain before locking it in. The semi-Slav actually just locks the bishop in by playing pawn to e6 instead of pawn to c6. But in the Slav, the player wants to try to get the light squared bishop out of the pawn chain. Play will continue from here with the knights developing to these three squares, just trying to develop the minor pieces. And black will now play pawn captures on c4. And white now has to play pawn to a4 in order to regain this material, so that this pawn is now attacking the square, preventing this pawn from coming up and maintaining the pawn on c4. This creates holes in the black position, particularly the b4 hole, where the bishop can easily just slide in to this spot, and it will be very difficult for the white player to get the bishop off that square for a large portion of the game. But play from here will continue with the bishop coming to f5, just trying to get the bishop out before the pawn is moved up to e6, as well as developing it here. You don't want to move it, to the square, even once this pawn moves up, because moving it to this square prevents the pawn on e4 from prevents the pawn on e to go to e4, just limiting what white can do. So this forces white to play e3 now in order to get this pawn back. And now black will now play the pawn to e6, freeing up this bishop to move, as well as completing the pawn structure. Many players like this pawn structure. This pawn structure comes up a lot in the Caro-Kann and the Scandinavian and various other openings, and it's a very solid pawn structure, and many players like to achieve this pawn structure. But as well, this also lets the bishop soon come to the b4 square, which is a weak point in the white position. So now play continues with white recapturing the material with the bishop, and now the bishop comes to b4. It's pinning the knight, but black won't take this knight. The bishop is too well placed to be traded for the knight. But white will now go ahead and castle to break the pin in case the knight needs to move. And now black will move the knight on b to d7. This is a common spot for the knight to go. You see this again in all the other variations, openings that have this pawn structure in the Caro-Kann and the Scandinavian. And it's mainly because this pawn is taking up the knight's ideal spot. But this spot allows the knight to later jump to 4 critical squares that will allow it to get pretty much anywhere you need it to go fairly quickly. And it also supports pawn pushes such as this, or maybe this if you get more protection on this square. So it's a very good place for the knight with this pawn structure. And this is the main line of the Slav defense. Another variation involves not having to move the a4 pawn up, and it looks like this. So now we see the Slav, and rather than seeing the knight develop, we'll just see e3 immediately, so that if black decides to take this pawn, white can immediately just develop the bishop and not have to create these holes in the position, so that the position is more solid at the beginning of the game. From here, black's still going to just develop the knight, and now the knights and the bishops develop just as they had previously, only this pawn was not captured and this pawn remained on the second rank. This is also known as the closed. The Slav declined, where black declines taking this pawn, simply because black takes the pawn in the other variation because it knows that white will create holes in the position as a result. and so it's not quite as favorable for black to take the pawn so early. Black will now take this pawn once this bishop moves maybe to this square, getting ready to castle the king on king side. So now taking the pawn will make the bishop move a second time to capture, and that will make white essentially have lost a turn. And that's pretty much how this variation will play out. The other variation that you'll see most commonly is the exchange variation. The exchange variation has been called a very boring or dull variation, simply because there's not a lot of tactics or tension. It's just kind of a very not exciting opening. It's the Slav, only white captures the pawn, and when black recaptures, now it's just going to be develop the minor pieces and just kind of play the game out as it just goes. An example would be where the knights develop and the bishops develop. Eventually this bishop's going to develop somewhere. Then this pawn could maybe come up after the bishop is out of the pawn chain. And it's just a really not exciting game. It has a high draw rate. So if you're playing white and all you need is a draw, you don't have to have a win, and you see the Slav defense, you might want to try the exchange variation, because it does have a tendency to lead to draws more often than not. So this is the Slav defense. I hope you can use it in your game, maybe help you out. It's a really solid opening for both sides, and I hope you enjoy the video, and please subscribe. Thanks.